Hello, TM24 here, and we are back with some more Marvel Snap content. If you are just now finding the channel, welcome. If you are a returning viewer, thank you for your continued support. Loki here appreciates it, and I certainly appreciate it as well. Now, if you've clicked on the video, you kind of have an idea of what I'm going to be talking about today. So, what I wanted to do was go through and pick a card from each cost, except for the 0 cost, and pick a card that I would like to see buffed, and a card that maybe needs to see a nerf, although I will say there were a couple costs that most of the cards felt very, very solid, very in line. None seemed too strong, but there are definitely a few cards that I think are maybe a little bit too strong for their cost. So I'm going to pick those cards, the ones I think need a buff and a nerf, and then I'm going to give you the change that I would like to see as well. Like I said, I'm not going to do 0 cost. There's only 2 of them. Both of them feel fine. If we're going to buff anything, it's going to be Wasp, of course, and that Wasp looks beautiful, so that one deserves buffing itself, but we're not doing 0 drops. We will jump right into the 1 drops, though, and a 1 drop that I would like to see buffed is actually Elektra here. So I think Elektra could be super cool, but 1/1 just feels very meh. It doesn't feel very strong. Yes, you could destroy a random enemy 1-cost card, but again, it's random, and there's no guaranteeing that they're even going to be playing a 1-drop. So the value just doesn't feel all that high to me. So I would like to see Elektra buffed, potentially to a 1/2. And I think that would give her a little bit more playability, a reason to actually include her in these decks. Right now, I feel like she's not seeing any play, so Elektra, I think, needs a buff. Now, there is one 1-drop that I feel needs maybe a little bit of a nerf. Really, it's not that strong. It can be easily countered, but it's Nebula here. I think going up +2 power for each turn that your opponent doesn't play something there is a bit steep. Now, changing this can be a little bit difficult. I think maybe putting Nebula up to a 1/2 and going up by only 1 would probably feel a little bit better. Your opponent wouldn't feel like they have to play on that location, but it would still be a bother not to play on that location. So I think maybe raising Nebula to a 1/2 and then changing this to +1 power would be the change that I would like to see made to Nebula. So that takes care of our 1-drops. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. We'll move right on to the 2-drops, and I think there's a clear candidate for a buff, and it's a card that I'm sure you guys have maybe never even seen in-game, or maybe at the most of rare occasions, and that's going to be Quake. So Quake 2/3 on reveal. If this is at the middle location, swap the positions of each location. I think that is a really cool effect. I don't know how you would actually use that effect to some advantage. Obviously, there are really niche cases where you can pull something cool off, but Quake, otherwise, I just don't see any point in playing just a 2/3. So raising Quake to a 2/4 would probably be the change that I would love to see in order to see Quake put into some more decks. It would also add another element of randomness to the game, which can be fun, can be frustrating at points, but I feel like Quake needs a little bit of a bump, so that's what I would look to do. So Quake goes in as the card that needs to be buffed. Now, there is a 2-drop that I'm super fond of, and although I don't want to say it, I think Jeff could probably do with a little change. I just think being able to reach those locations, being able to play it on, a Professor X, a Spider-Man lane, I think that is so strong. And I think changing Jeff from a 2/3 to a 2/2 wouldn't be all that detrimental to him, and he would still see some play. He might not feel as strong as he is right now, but I do think that would be a nice change for Jeff. Obviously, that opens up the world of Cerebro 2 decks, now having access to Jeff and a Nightcrawler, so being able to move some cards around. But just for looking at Jeff by himself, I think maybe dropping to a 2/2 would be a good move. I don't think he's overpowered by any means, but since I'm picking a card for each cost, Jeff is the one I'm picking for the 2-drops. So moving right along to the 3-drops here. Now, there's a 3-drop that I would love to see buffed. It's a card I use a ton, but it's really only used in kind of, I don't want to say meme decks, but definitely decks where you're more trying to pull something cool off as opposed to a super competitive card, and that would be Kingpin. So I really like Kingpin's design. I think it's a really cool, unique effect. But 3-4 sometimes just feels a little weak where you may not ever even be able to pull off his ability. So I think buffing Kingpin to a 3-5 would seem fair and still have the ability to potentially have that ability pulled off, but not necessarily relying on it either. I think it would stack up well with some of these other cards, like a Polaris being at a 3-5 or a Deathlock. Very, very similar. So I think Kingpin could do with 1 extra power going to a 3-5 here. Now, a 3-drop that I think potentially needs a little nerf. Again, most of these 3-drops feel pretty good, but the one that I see is Thor. And it's not really Thor himself. I think Thor is fine, but I think Mjolnir giving 6 power and being able to activate it multiple times, tossing it through things like Lockjaw, are just absolutely insane. So giving +6 power to Thor puts him at a 310. And if we look at the rest of these 3-drop cards, none of them really even come close. The closest one is going to be Dazzler, getting potentially all the way up to a 3-8. So for that reason, I think taking maybe 1 power, maybe even 2 power off of Mjolnir would be an acceptable change. Taking 2 power off, he still's a 3-8. Taking 1 off, he's a 3-9. So that is the one change that I would make in the 3-drops. Overall, Thor doesn't feel oppressive, but a lot of times if you get Thor down in a lane, it feels like you're way ahead in that lane, even if you haven't drawn Mjolnir yet. So that's the one 3-drop that I would potentially look at changing. We're flying through these, but that's okay. We're going to go right to the 4-drops. And again, I think we have another obvious candidate of a card that hasn't really seen any play. I definitely haven't seen it in a game, and I don't even know how long. And that's going to be Strong Guy. So ongoing, if your hand is empty, +6 power. Now, there are just not a lot of decks that are going to empty their hand. Even the discard decks using MODOK, typically you have Apocalypse, so you can't even make use out of Strong Guy. So really, what is he doing? He's just a 4-4 that there's no reason to put in a list. So what I would say is potentially buffing Strong Guy up, maybe swapping this to a 4-6 and the ongoing to a +4. So putting him at a 4-6 puts him similar to things like Namor, like White Queen. So I think buffing Strong Guy up to a 4-6, dropping his ongoing to a +4, just so that he's got a presence even without the ongoing, I think would do wonders for him, and maybe he'd actually become playable. Now, 4-drops were one where I looked at all these cards and I went, wow, most of these feel pretty fair. There's only one 4-drop that when I play it, I feel like, wow, that was a really good play, even just as a 4-drop. So I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to go to the high evolutionary version of the thing. Again, I don't think this is even all that overpowered, but playing him as a 4-9 with no real downside just feels a little bit too strong. Maybe a 4-8 would be better. So take away one of these powers. So when I say 4-9, he's a 4-6 by himself, but you're affecting one of your opponent's cards by -3. So essentially he's a 4-9. If we went down to repeating only one time, so a 4-8 at that point, I think that feels a little bit better. It's maybe a little bit more in line with some of these cards. A 4-8, similar to Crossbones, where he still has a pretty tough effect to pull off. These 4-10s have some pretty detrimental effects to them. So I can see, a world where dropping this down to, repeating only once would be a suitable change for the thing. But the problem that you run into with that is when you've got a card like Wasp, you know, the high evolutionary version of Wasp is affecting -2 power as well. So at that point, is it worth playing the thing? I don't know, but he's the one 4-drop that when I play, I feel like, wow, I made a really, really nice play. So that is the card that we are going to add. Just remember, it is the high evolutionary version of the thing. Now we're getting onto the 5-drops, and this one might be a little bit controversial. But again, looking at all these 5-drops, most of them feel pretty good. I've seen them in decks, I've played them myself, but there's one card that has significantly less playtime than others, and that actually is Kang. So I think Kang is super cool. Being able to see what your opponent is doing or did, and then potentially changing your play, maybe not, I think is huge. But a lot of the times, if you don't have the cards in your hand to do anything about it, Kang is really just, you're delaying the inevitable. So I find it tough to find a spot for Kang. Now, it wouldn't make sense to change his cost or change his power because he's going to go away anyway. So the one change that I would make is potentially draw a card. So at the end of the turn, when Kang's going away, he's going to slip you a card before he goes, and I feel like that would be a good change for Kang. Now, the problem I see with this is essentially you could use him just as a late game draw to find that last piece that you need to make sure you win the game. Would that make him overpowered? Maybe, but I don't see another way that you could change Kang without, adding card draw or reducing the cost down. Even at a 4-0, I don't know how effective that would be. Maybe you could play him in a smaller deck, but I think maybe adding one card would definitely up his power level, but it might be too much. If you guys have a different way that you would change Kang, feel free to put it in the comments below, but that's what I would do. Let him draw a card as he's sliding away. Now again, 5-drops. We ran into a spot where almost all of these feel pretty good. The one that I'll say feels really, really strong, and maybe it's just because it's new right now, is Phoenix Force. So reviving one of your destroyed cards and merging with it, whether that's a multiple man, a Human Torch, a Vulture, those are all just the move pieces. But Phoenix Force feels amazing right now. So what change would we make to this? It's really tough. Maybe dropping it down to a 5-5 or even a 5-4 would be good, but then you're dodging things like Shang-Chi, so you wouldn't have the ability to counter Phoenix Force in that manner. But that's, of course, depending on what it is combining with. If it's combining with a multiple man, for instance, it gets up to a 5-9. But if you drop it down to a 5-5, it's a 5-8. All of a sudden, those can't be touched by Shang-Chi. So I don't know if dropping the power is the right call. And like I said, I don't even feel that Phoenix Force needs a change. I think it's too early. But since I had to pick one that feels a little bit too strong right now, it's going to be Phoenix Force. And now we're moving to our 6-drops. And there is one 6-drop I feel needs some help. And it's going to be Giganto. Being able to play at only the left location is really, really tough. And 14 power is strong, but a lot of the times that location you might not even be able to play in it. So a change that I would like to see would actually be something similar to the wording on Sentry. Just take this top half though. You can't play this at the right location. So that would at least give us 2 locations that we could play Giganto at. And maybe with that change, you'd have to drop him down to 13 power, but I would leave him at 14 first, make that change, and see how he affects the gameplay. Maybe he's not going to affect it at all, but that's the one change that I would do. Allow him to be played into the left lane or into the middle lane, just so that he could see a little bit more play. And then finally, we're coming to the one 6-drop that potentially needs a nerf. Dr. Doom was just hit, otherwise I would say him. I still feel like Dr. Doom is very, very strong, but I think going down to a 3-power Doombot would be way too much. Everything else feels pretty good, but one 6-drop that I find a lot in my decks, and I see in actually just a ton of decks in general, is Chavez. And it is because of her ability, really, that she seems so valuable. providing that consistent draw, allowing you to hit the cards you need to hit. So how would you even change Chavez? The only thing that I could see would be affecting her power. And then we run into a situation like we did with Phoenix Force, where now all of a sudden she dodges things like Shang-Chi, and maybe that actually is a buff. But if we dropped her all the way down to, a 6-8, she's in line with some of these cards, still has a super strong effect. She dodges Shang-Chi at that point. Even a 6-7, maybe her effect would then not be quite as strong or feel in line with some of these other 6-7s. But I think maybe 6-8 would be a good home for Chavez. So changing her to a 6-8 would be the change that I would make. And these have been the changes that I would make to some of these cards, the buffs and the nerfs. Now, like I said, some of these cards I feel don't need to be changed at all. I feel like the 4s, the 5s, the 6s, even the 3s all feel really, really good. There are definitely a few 2-drops that I feel are really strong. Jeff feels like he's one of the strongest to me, but the rest of them feel pretty good. Now, the cards that I feel needed to be buffed in Elektra, Quake, Kingpin, Strong Guy, Kang, and Giganto. I would love to see those changes just to see a little bit more play from those types of cards. But I don't feel that it's absolutely necessary that every card be playable all the time. So just some thoughts that I wanted to toss out there. Let me know what you guys think of the changes that I said I would make. What are some changes that you would make? Are there any cards that you think need to be buffed or need to be nerfed? Please feel free to put those in the comments below. If you've hung around till now would also be a good time to hit that subscribe and like button if you haven't already. And until the next time, have some fun.